The coral snake's fangs sank deep into Ethan Blackwood's wrist just as his 3-year-old daughter Emma dropped her rag doll beneath the porch steps. Time crystallized, his weathered hand frozen mid-reach, blue eyes widening in recognition of the red, yellow, and black bands coiled around his forearm. Death had found him 18 months after burying his wife, Rebecca. Little Joshua screamed from the yard, his 5-year-old voice cracking like breaking glass. Baby Samuel's wails pierced the September heat as Emma stood motionless, watching her father stumble backward. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he collapsed, poison already burning through his veins. Rebecca's quilt still hung on the line where she'd left it before the fever took her. Now their 3 babies would have no one. "God help them," Ethan whispered, his vision blurring. Through the shimmering heat waves, a lone rider approached, a woman carrying something wrapped in white cloth. But who would come to this God-forsaken homestead? And would she arrive before the venom claimed another parent from these innocent souls? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The autumn sun blazed mercilessly over Cedar Ridge, Texas, where the wind carried nothing but dust and broken dreams across the endless prairie. This was cattle country, where men carved their lives from unforgiving earth and women buried too many babies before their time. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles east, the doctor 15 miles south in San Angelo, and civilization felt as distant as the stars. Ethan Blackwood had claimed his 160 acres under the Homestead Act 3 years ago, back when Rebecca's laughter filled their modest cabin and hope seemed as abundant as the spring grass. Now the 2-room structure stood like a weathered gravestone against the horizon, its walls echoing with memories of a woman who would never see another Texas sunrise. At 28, Ethan carried the weight of a man twice his age. His blonde hair had grown shaggy from months of neglect, and his blue eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd buried his heart alongside his wife. The children had become his entire world. Joshua, with his serious 5-year-old face and sense of responsibility that broke Ethan's heart. Little Emma, who still asked when Mama was coming home, and baby Samuel, who cried for a woman he'd never truly known. The homestead itself told the story of a man barely surviving. Laundry hung crooked on the line, dishes piled in the wash basin, and the vegetable garden Rebecca had tended with such care now struggled against weeds and neglect. Ethan worked as a part-time deputy sheriff when Sheriff Morrison needed extra hands, but the $20 a month barely covered supplies from Henderson's general store. The remaining $180 owed to Cattleman's Bank loomed over him like a thundercloud, with foreclosure papers already drawn up in Banker Hawkins' desk. Each morning brought the same crushing routine, changing Samuel's soiled clothes, coaxing Emma to eat cornmeal mush, sending Joshua to gather eggs from their 3 remaining chickens. The boy had grown quiet since his mother's death, taking on burdens no child should carry. He'd learned to comfort Emma's nightmares and rock baby Samuel when Ethan collapsed from exhaustion. The loneliness ate at Ethan worse than hunger. Evenings were the hardest when the children finally slept and silence pressed against him like a physical weight. He'd sit at their rough-hewn table staring at the empty chair where Rebecca used to mend clothes and hum old hymns. Sometimes he caught himself setting 4 plates instead of 3, his hands moving from memory. Mrs. Martha Henderson, their nearest neighbor, helped when she could, but her own arthritis and failing eyesight limited her assistance. The other women in Cedar Ridge offered polite sympathy, but kept their distance. 3 young children and a desperate widower represented complications they preferred to avoid. This was the life that had driven Ethan to his knees in prayer each night, begging God for strength to see another dawn, for wisdom to raise his children right, for some sign that they weren't completely alone in this harsh and unforgiving world. The coral snake's venom worked with terrifying efficiency, sending liquid fire through Ethan's veins as he collapsed against the porch steps. His vision blurred at the edges, and he could hear his heartbeat thundering in his ears like distant war drums. Joshua's screams pierced the afternoon air, while Emma stood frozen, her small hand still reaching toward the spot where her doll had fallen. "Papa!" Joshua's voice cracked with terror as he ran toward his father, but Ethan managed to raise his good hand in warning. "Stay back, son!" he gasped, fighting to keep consciousness. "Take your sister and Samuel inside. Lock the door." The approaching rider grew larger against the shimmering heat, and Ethan's fevered mind wondered if he was hallucinating. Through the haze of pain he could make out a woman on horseback, her auburn hair escaping from beneath a simple bonnet. She rode with the confidence of someone who knew these lands, sitting straight in the saddle despite the rough terrain. "Hello there," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. Then she must have noticed the chaos: Joshua's panicked movements, Emma's tears, Ethan slumped against the steps, because she urged her horse into a gallop. Grace Whitmore had been riding hard since dawn, following the dusty trail that led away from her father's latest hideout in the Davis Mountains. The bundle wrapped in white cloth, tied to her saddle, contained fresh-baked bread, a peace offering she'd planned to leave at the first homestead she found. She'd been running from her father's life for months now, and the sight of this remote ranch had seemed like Providence itself. But as she drew closer, Providence revealed itself as something far more urgent. "Sir, are you hurt?" she called, dismounting in one fluid motion. Her green eyes quickly assessed the scene: the man's ashen complexion, the distinctive bite marks on his wrist, the three terrified children. "Rattlesnake," Ethan managed, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "No, coral snake. My children are inside." Grace's blood chilled. Coral snakes were among the deadliest creatures in Texas, their neurotoxic venom far more dangerous than any rattler. She'd seen men die from such bites during her years with her father's gang, watched helplessly as the poison shut down their nervous systems, one breath at a time. "I'm Grace Whitmore," she said, already kneeling beside him and examining the wound with practiced hands. The bite was fresh, maybe 5 minutes old, but she could already see the telltale swelling beginning around the puncture marks. "I need to get a closer look at this." "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but you should get those children to safety," Ethan said, trying to focus on her face. "I don't want them to see—" "Hush now," Grace interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "You're not dying on my watch." She pulled a small folding knife from her boot, the blade gleaming sharp in the afternoon sun. My father taught me about treating snake bites. I've done this before." What she didn't tell him was that her education had come from patching up wounded outlaws in her father's gang, men who'd been shot or bitten during their raids across the frontier. Crimson Jack Whitmore had insisted his daughter learn medicine after their gang's doctor died in a shootout, reasoning that bullet wounds and snake bites didn't discriminate between outlaws and lawmen. Grace worked quickly, using strips torn from her petticoat to create a tourniquet above the bite. Her movements were sure and practiced as she made precise incisions over the fang marks, extracting what venom she could. Ethan watched through waves of pain and nausea, amazed by her calm competence. "This will help with the pain," she said, pulling a small bottle from her saddlebags. The liquid inside was dark and aromatic, a mixture of willow bark extract and other herbs she'd learned to prepare during long nights in outlaw camps. "It's not a cure, but it should slow the poison's spread." As Grace administered the medicine, the cabin door creaked open. Joshua peered out, his young face streaked with tears. Behind him, Emma clutched baby Samuel, who was wailing at the top of his lungs. "Papa hurt?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Grace looked up at the children, her heart clenching at their obvious terror. "Your papa is going to be fine," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm Miss Grace, and I'm here to help. Are you brave children who can help me take care of your father? Joshua stepped forward, his small shoulders squared with determination. I can help. I'm the man of the house when Papa's hurt. The simple declaration nearly broke Grace's heart. This boy couldn't be more than 5 years old, yet he was already carrying burdens that would challenge grown men. She thought of her own childhood, thrust into violence and responsibility far too young, and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. That's very brave of you, she said gently. Can you help me get your father inside where it's cooler, and maybe find some clean water? With surprising strength for her size, Grace helped Ethan to his feet and guided him toward the cabin. The interior was neat, but showed clear signs of a man struggling alone. Mending piled in a basket, toys scattered across the floor, dishes waiting to be washed. Yet there was love here too. Visible in the careful way the children's clothes were patched, in the wildflowers Emma had picked and placed in a mason jar on the table. As they settled Ethan onto his bed, Grace continued her treatment, rebandaging the wound and checking his pulse. The venom was definitely in his system. His pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow, but her quick intervention had bought them precious time. I need to ride for the doctor, she said, her brow furrowed with concern. But I can't leave you alone with the children in this condition. Mrs. Henderson, Ethan suggested weakly. Martha Henderson, 5 miles east. She's helped us before. Grace shook her head. I passed her place on the way here, saw her loading a wagon with her son. Looked like they were heading to town. She paused, weighing her options. The nearest doctor was hours away, and leaving this man alone with 3 small children would be tantamount to murder. I'm staying, she announced, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. I'll care for you and the children until you're well enough to manage on your own. Ethan tried to protest, but Grace hushed him again. She moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, settling the children and preparing a simple supper from the supplies she found in their pantry. As twilight painted the sky purple and gold, she sat beside Ethan's bed, monitoring his breathing and administering her herbal medicine at regular intervals. The children gathered around her like moths to flame, hungry for the maternal comfort they'd been missing. Grace found herself telling them stories, her voice soft in the gathering darkness, while outside the Texas wind whispered promises and secrets across the endless prairie. Dawn broke over the Texas prairie with the gentleness of a mother's touch, and Ethan Blackwood woke to find himself alive against all odds. The burning in his veins had subsided to a dull ache, and his vision had cleared enough to see Grace Whitmore sitting in the rocking chair beside his bed, her auburn hair catching the morning light streaming through the cabin's single window. "Good morning," she said softly, setting aside the mending she'd been working on. "How are you feeling?" Ethan struggled to sit up, amazed that he could move without the crushing pain that had dominated the previous evening. "Better. Much better than I have any right to be." His voice was hoarse but steady. "You saved my life." Grace's cheeks flushed pink. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Ethan said firmly. "What you did, the way you treated that bite, that wasn't common knowledge." "You've had medical training." Before Grace could respond, the cabin door burst open and Joshua rushed in, followed closely by Emma and a toddling Samuel. The children had obviously been waiting anxiously for their father to wake up. "Papa!" Emma threw herself onto the bed, her small arms wrapping around Ethan's neck. "Miss Grace said you were going to be okay, but I was scared you'd go to heaven like Mama." Ethan's throat tightened as he gathered his children close. Over their heads, he met Grace's eyes and saw something there that made his heart skip. A longing so deep it took his breath away. She was watching his reunion with his children as if witnessing a miracle she'd never believed possible. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, kissing the top of Emma's head. "Thanks to Miss Grace." Joshua, ever serious beyond his years, turned to Grace with the solemnity of a judge. Are you going to stay and take care of us? We need someone to help Papa." Grace's composure wavered. I I should be moving on soon. I was just traveling through when—" "Please stay," Emma interrupted, her blue eyes wide with hope. "You make the best breakfast, and you know stories about princesses that Papa don't know." Samuel, not to be outdone, toddled over to Grace and raised his arms to be picked up. When she lifted him, he nestled against her shoulder with the complete trust that only children possess. Grace felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. She'd spent years hardening her heart, building defenses against the kind of vulnerability these children represented. But their innocent acceptance, their desperate need for maternal love, was breaking down barriers she'd thought were permanent. Over the next 3 days, Grace found herself settling into a routine that felt dangerously like home. She cooked meals that filled the cabin with warmth and laughter, mended clothes with skilled hands, and told bedtime stories that transported the children to worlds beyond the harsh Texas prairie. Most remarkably, she began to remember what it felt like to be needed for something good, something pure. Ethan watched her transformation with growing wonder. The guarded woman who'd arrived with mysterious medical knowledge was revealing herself to be gentle and nurturing, with an intuitive understanding of what his children needed. She sang lullabies in a voice sweet enough to calm even Samuel's most persistent crying, and she had endless patience for Emma's chatter and Joshua's serious questions about everything from arithmetic to why the sky was blue. But there were moments when shadows crossed Grace's face, when she would pause in her work and stare out the window as if watching for something on the horizon. Ethan began to notice other things too, the way she always positioned herself where she could see both the door and the windows, how she never fully relaxed even during the most peaceful moments, and the strange skills she displayed that seemed far beyond those of any ordinary frontier woman. On the 4th evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. "Grace, where did you really learn to treat snake bites like that? And don't tell me it was from traveling. That was expert-level medical knowledge." Grace's hands stilled in her lap, and for a long moment she didn't speak. When she finally looked at him, her green eyes held a pain so deep it took his breath away. "My father," she said quietly. He insisted I learn medicine. Said it was practical knowledge for the life we lived." "What kind of life was that?" Grace stood abruptly, walking to the porch railing and gripping it with white knuckles. "The kind of life where people get shot regularly, where knowing how to dig bullets out of flesh and treat knife wounds can mean the difference between life and death." Ethan's blood chilled as the implications of her words sank in. "Grace, what exactly did your father do?" She turned to face him, and in that moment he saw the full weight of the burden she'd been carrying. "My father is John Whitmore. They call him Crimson Jack. He's the leader of the most wanted gang of outlaws in Texas." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Ethan had heard of Crimson Jack Whitmore. Every lawman in Texas had. The man was a legend of violence and brutality, responsible for dozens of robberies and an unknown number of deaths. There was a $5,000 bounty on his head, the largest ever offered in the state. "Sweet Jesus," Ethan breathed. "I ran away 3 months ago," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stand it anymore. The killing, the constant running, the way he expected me to participate in his crimes. I've been traveling ever since, trying to find some place where the Whitmore name doesn't carry the stench of blood." Ethan struggled to reconcile this revelation with the gentle woman who had saved his life and cared for his children with such tenderness. "Grace, whatever your father did, whatever you might have been forced to do—" "You don't understand," she interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "I've killed people, Ethan. I shot a man in Abilene when I was 16 because he tried to assault me during a robbery. I've helped treat wounded gang members, knowing they'd ride out the next day to hurt more innocent people. I'm not the woman you think I am. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither could fully process. From inside the cabin came the sound of the children's laughter as they played with the wooden toys Ethan had carved for them, a sharp contrast to the dark truths being revealed on the porch. Ethan stood slowly, his movements careful as he approached Grace. She flinched when he reached for her, but he gently took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder choices. "I don't care," he said simply. Grace stared at him in disbelief. "You don't understand what I'm telling you. I'm the daughter of the most dangerous outlaw in Texas. I have blood on my hands. Your children—" "My children adore you," Ethan interrupted firmly. "And so do I." The admission surprised them both. They'd been dancing around their growing attraction for days, but neither had spoken of it directly. Now, with Grace's terrible secret hanging between them, Ethan found himself speaking from the heart with a clarity that startled him. "Grace, I've watched you with Joshua, Emma, and Samuel. I've seen the way you care for them, the patience and love you show them every day. Whatever you might have done in the past, that's not who you are now. That's not who you choose to be." "But your reputation," Grace protested. "The danger. If my father finds me—" "Then we'll face that when it comes," Ethan said. "But I won't let fear of what might happen steal away the happiness of what's happening right now." Grace searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or doubt. But Ethan's blue eyes held only sincerity and a growing love that made her knees weak. For the first time in her life, someone was looking at her and seeing not the outlaw's daughter, not the killer's accomplice, but simply a woman worthy of love. "The children need you," he continued. "And God help me, so do I." As if summoned by his words, Emma appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair mussed from play. "Miss Grace, are you crying? Did Papa make you sad?" Grace wiped her tears and managed a smile. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're happy too." Emma considered this with the seriousness that only a 3-year-old could muster. "Are you happy here with us?" Grace looked at Ethan, then at the little girl who had claimed her heart so completely. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I am." The days that followed Grace's confession settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and precarious, like walking across ice that might crack at any moment. Ethan found himself studying her with new eyes, searching for signs of the violence she claimed lived in her past. But all he saw was the gentle woman who braided Emma's hair each morning and taught Joshua his letters by lamplight. Grace, for her part, seemed determined to prove herself worthy of the trust Ethan had placed in her. She threw herself into caring for the family with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if each perfectly cooked meal and each bedtime story could somehow atone for the sins she carried. But beneath her determined cheerfulness, Ethan noticed the way she still positioned herself to watch the horizon, and how she never fully relaxed even during their most peaceful moments. It was during their second week together that Deputy Cole Morrison arrived at the homestead, his badge glinting in the morning sun as he dismounted from his sorrel gelding. Grace had been hanging laundry on the line, but at the sight of the lawman she moved instinctively closer to the children, her body language shifting into something Ethan recognized as defensive preparation. "Morning, Ethan," Morrison called out, his weathered face serious beneath the brim of his hat. "Heard you had some trouble with a snake bite. Glad to see you're up and about." "Thanks to Miss Whitmore here," Ethan replied, noting how Grace's hands had stilled on the clothesline. "She appeared just when we needed her most." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Grace with the studied intensity of a man who'd spent years reading people's secrets. "Miss Whitmore, is it? Mind if I ask where you're traveling from?" Grace lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. Austin originally, though I've been on the road for some time. I'm a seamstress by trade, looking for a place to settle down and establish my business. It was a plausible lie, one she'd rehearsed during her months of running. Morrison nodded slowly, but Ethan could see the suspicion in his eyes. The deputy had always been thorough in his investigations, and Grace's sudden appearance at the homestead was exactly the kind of coincidence that made lawmen nervous. "Funny thing," Morrison continued conversationally, "been hearing reports of strangers in the area. Folks asking questions about homesteads, about families with children. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Grace's face remained carefully neutral, but Ethan saw her fingers tighten on the wet sheet she was holding. "I'm afraid not, Deputy. I've been focused on caring for Mr. Blackwood and his children since the snake bite incident." Morrison's attention shifted to the children, who had gathered around their father with the instinctive wariness children show toward strangers in authority. Emma peeked out from behind Ethan's leg, while Joshua stood protectively near baby Samuel. "Fine-looking family," Morrison observed. "Be a real shame if anything happened to them. These are dangerous times, with outlaws and such roaming the territory. A man's got to be careful who he trusts, especially when he's got young ones to protect." The warning was subtle but clear, and Ethan felt a surge of protective anger. "Deputy Morrison, Miss Whitmore saved my life and has been nothing but kind to my children. I'd appreciate it if you'd show her the respect she deserves." Morrison raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "No offense intended, Ethan. Just doing my job, keeping folks safe. But I'll tell you what, I've got word that the Whitmore gang's been active again. Hit a bank in Junction last month, killed 2 guards. Crimson Jack's got a taste for blood, and he don't leave witnesses." Grace's face went pale, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "That's terrible news, Deputy. I hope they're caught soon." "Oh, they will be," Morrison assured her. "Got bounty hunters tracking them now, in addition to the regular law. $5,000 is a powerful motivator. Makes folks real eager to turn in anyone who might be connected to that gang." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Morrison tipped his hat to Grace and mounted his horse, but before riding away he turned back to Ethan. "You be careful, friend. Sometimes the devil comes wearing an angel's face." After Morrison disappeared into the distance, Grace sank onto the porch steps as if her legs could no longer support her. Ethan sat beside her, noting the way her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. "He knows," she whispered. "Maybe not everything, but he suspects." "Morrison's suspicious of everyone," Ethan said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the deputy's visit had been more than routine. "He's been a lawman too long. Sees threats everywhere." Grace shook her head. "You don't understand. If my father really did rob that bank in Junction, if people died—" She looked at him with eyes full of anguish. "This is what I was afraid of. My past is catching up to me, and now it's going to destroy your family too." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the children seemed to sense the tension between the adults. Joshua picked at his food, his young face troubled, while Emma kept glancing between her father and Grace as if trying to understand why the happy atmosphere had changed. "Miss Grace?" Emma said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "Are you going to leave us?" Grace's fork clattered against her plate. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "You look sad like Mama did before she went to heaven," Emma replied with the devastating honesty of childhood. "I don't want you to go to heaven, too." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to take Emma's small hand. "I'm not going to heaven, Emma. I'm just worried about some things." "What kind of things?" Joshua asked, his serious eyes fixed on Grace's face. "Is it about that deputy man? He didn't seem very nice." Ethan marveled at his son's perceptiveness. At 5 years old, Joshua had already learned to read the subtle currents of adult emotion, a skill forced on him by the loss of his mother and the struggles that followed. "Sometimes grown-ups have problems that are hard to explain," Grace said carefully. "But I want you to know that taking care of you and your father and baby Samuel has been the most important thing I've ever done." "Then don't stop," Emma said simply. "Stay forever and ever." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Ethan and Grace sat on the porch in the cooling air. The Texas sky stretched endlessly above them, studded with stars that seemed close enough to touch. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying across the prairie like a warning. "I should go," Grace said quietly. "Tonight, while they're sleeping. It would be easier for everyone." Ethan turned to face her, his expression fierce in the moonlight. "Easier for who? Certainly not for the children. Emma hasn't had a nightmare since you arrived. Joshua actually smiles now. And Samuel?" He gestured toward the cabin. "That boy follows you around like you hung the moon." "And what about when my father comes looking for me?" Grace challenged. "Because he will, Ethan." "Crimson Jack doesn't let go of anything he considers his property, and in his twisted mind, that's what I am." "Then we'll be ready for him," Ethan said firmly. Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're talking about facing the most dangerous outlaw in Texas, a man who's killed more people than you've probably met in your entire life. You're a good man, Ethan, but you're not a gunfighter." "Maybe not," Ethan admitted, "but I'm not helpless either. I've been a deputy sheriff for 2 years. I know how to handle a gun, and I know this land better than any stranger. If your father wants to threaten my family, he'll find I'm not as easy a target as he might expect." Grace studied his face in the moonlight, seeing a determination there that both thrilled and terrified her. This gentle farmer, this caring father, was willing to risk everything to protect her. The knowledge was overwhelming. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you take such a risk for someone like me?" Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Because I love you, Grace. Not despite what you've been, but because of who you are now. You came into our lives when we needed you most, and you've given us hope again. You've given me hope again." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning a chasm. Grace felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling completely, replaced by something she'd never allowed herself to feel before, the possibility of being truly loved and accepted. "I love you too," she admitted, the words barely audible. "I've tried not to, tried to keep my distance, but these children, this family, it's everything I've ever wanted and never believed I could have." Ethan leaned closer, and when his lips met hers, it was with a tenderness that spoke of promises and forever. For a moment, the dangers lurking in their future seemed distant and manageable. For a moment, they were simply a man and woman discovering love in the vast loneliness of the frontier. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, multiple horses moving fast across the hardpan. Grace pulled away from Ethan's embrace, her body instantly alert. "Someone's coming," she whispered, her hand moving instinctively to the knife she kept hidden in her boot. Multiple riders, moving at night. That's never good news. Ethan rose and moved toward the cabin, his mind racing through possibilities. Honest travelers didn't ride hard in the darkness unless they were running from something or chasing it. As the sound grew closer, he could make out at least 6 horses, maybe more. "Grace," he said urgently, "take the children and hide in the root cellar. There's a hidden entrance behind the woodpile." But Grace was already shaking her head, her face grim with recognition. "It's too late for hiding, Ethan." "They're here." As if summoned by her words, a group of riders materialized from the darkness, their horses breathing hard from the long gallop. In the moonlight, Ethan could see the glint of weapons and the hard faces of men accustomed to violence. At their head rode a figure that made Grace's blood turn to ice in her veins. Crimson Jack Whitmore sat his horse like a king surveying his domain, his graying hair flowing beneath a black hat that had become his trademark. Even in the uncertain light, his presence commanded attention. This was a man who had shaped his own legend through blood and brutality. "Hello, daughter," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Time to come home." Grace stepped protectively in front of Ethan, her small frame seemingly fragile against the mounted threat before them. But when she spoke, her voice carried a steel that surprised even her. "I am home, Father." "And I'm not leaving." Crimson Jack's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "We'll see about that, little girl. We'll see about that." The 12 riders spread out in a semicircle around the homestead, their horses snorting and pawing the ground as if sensing the tension that crackled through the night air. Crimson Jack Whitmore dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age, his spurs jingling ominously as his boots hit the packed earth. In the moonlight, his face was all sharp angles and weathered scars, the kind of face that haunted wanted posters across 3 states. "You've led us quite a chase, Grace," he said, his voice deceptively mild as he approached the porch. 3 months of cold trails and dead ends. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" Grace remained perfectly still, but Ethan could see the tremor in her hands. "I wasn't causing trouble, Father. I was trying to escape it." "Escape?" Jack's laugh was harsh. "There's no escaping family, daughter. Blood calls to blood, and you're a Whitmore whether you like it or not." Behind Jack, the other gang members remained mounted, their weapons clearly visible in the moonlight. Ethan recognized the type, hard men with dead eyes who'd crossed lines that normal people never even approached. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt, but Jack noticed the movement immediately. "I wouldn't, Farmer," Jack said casually, his own hand resting on the grip of his Colt Peacemaker. "My boys get nervous when folks reach for iron, and nervous men tend to shoot first and ask questions later." From inside the cabin came the sound of baby Samuel crying, awakened by the commotion. Grace's maternal instincts overrode her fear, and she started toward the door, but Jack's voice stopped her cold. "Leave the brat. We have business to discuss." "Don't you dare call him that!" Grace snapped, her voice carrying a fury that made even some of the hardened outlaws shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "These children have done nothing to you." Jack's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Protective of them, are you? How touching. Tell me, Grace, have you been playing house with this dirt farmer, pretending to be a respectable woman?" Ethan stepped forward, his fear for Grace overriding his natural caution. "Mr. Whitmore, your daughter saved my life. She's been nothing but kind to my children and—" "Mr. Whitmore," Jack interrupted, his eyebrows raising in mock surprise. "How delightfully formal. Tell me, Farmer, do you know what your precious Grace has done? The blood she spilled in my name?" "I know enough," Ethan replied steadily. "I know she's a good woman who deserves a chance at a peaceful life." "A good woman?" Jack's voice rose, and for the first time his carefully controlled demeanor cracked. "She's killed 3 men that I know of, maybe more. Her first was when she was just 16. Put a bullet right through a lawman's heart when he got too close to our camp. Should have seen the way his blood sprayed." "Stop it!" Grace's voice cut through the night like a whip crack. "You're the one who put a gun in my hand. You're the one who forced me to become something I never wanted to be." The cabin door creaked open, and Joshua appeared in the doorway, his young face pale with fear. "Papa, what's happening? Who are these men?" The sight of the 5-year-old seemed to trigger something in Jack, and his expression shifted into something almost fond. "Well now, would you look at that? You've got yourself a ready-made family, Grace. How very domestic." Grace moved protectively toward Joshua, but Jack raised his hand in a gesture that stopped her. "I'm not going to hurt the boy," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Children are innocent. It's the adults who make the choices that damn them." His gaze shifted back to Ethan. "Tell me, farmer, what do you think happens when word gets out that you're harboring the daughter of Crimson Jack Whitmore? How long before your neighbors start asking questions? How long before some bounty hunter decides your little family might know where to find me?" The threat was subtle, but devastating. Ethan felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He thought of Emma and Samuel sleeping inside, of Joshua standing vulnerable in the doorway, and realized that Jack was right. Grace's presence here put them all in danger. "That's what I thought," Jack continued, reading the conflict on Ethan's face. "You're starting to understand the reality of the situation. My daughter isn't some lost lamb you can save with good intentions and Christian charity. She's a wolf, farmer, and wolves don't change their nature just because they find a comfortable sheepfold." "You're wrong," Grace said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She could see the doubt creeping into Ethan's eyes, could feel the foundation of their newfound happiness beginning to crack. Jack pressed his advantage. "Am I?" "Tell him about the bank in Abilene, Grace. Tell him about the family you helped me rob, about the little girl who cried when we took her father's money. Tell him how you held the horses while we cleaned out their life savings." Grace's face went white. "I was 17. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Jack said softly. "You chose to stay with me. You chose to learn the skills I taught you. You chose to be my daughter in every way that mattered." From inside the cabin, Emma's voice called out tearfully, "Papa, I'm scared. Where's Miss Grace?" The sound of his daughter's distress galvanized Ethan into action. He moved toward the cabin, but one of Jack's men spurred his horse forward, blocking the path. "Easy there, farmer," the outlaw said, his hand resting casually on his rifle. "Boss ain't done talking yet." Jack walked closer to the porch, his boots echoing hollowly on the wooden steps. "Here's what's going to happen. Grace is coming with us, back where she belongs. You're going to forget you ever saw her, and in return, I'm going to forget I ever saw you or your children." "And if I refuse?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Jack's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Then I stop being reasonable about this whole situation. And trust me, farmer, you don't want to see me when I'm not feeling reasonable." Grace looked between her father and the man she'd come to love, seeing the impossible position she'd placed him in. Everything Jack had said was true. Her presence here was a danger to Ethan and his children, a threat that would follow them for as long as she remained. "He's right," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I should go." "Grace, no," Ethan started, but she cut him off. "Look at them," she said, gesturing toward Jack's men. "Look at what my life brings with it. These children deserve better. They deserve safety and peace, not the constant threat of violence that follows the Whitmore name." Joshua, who had been listening from the doorway with the intense concentration that only children possess, suddenly stepped forward. "Miss Grace, don't go. We love you." The simple declaration hung in the air like an accusation. Jack's expression darkened, and he took another step closer to the boy. "Love?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Boy, you don't know what love is. Love is what keeps a family together through blood and bullets. Love is what makes a man protect what's his, no matter the cost." "That's not love," Grace said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. "That's possession. That's fear. Real love means wanting what's best for someone, even if it means letting them go." Jack's hand moved to his gun, and the temperature of the confrontation shifted dramatically. "Careful, daughter. You're walking on dangerous ground." But Grace had reached some internal breaking point. Years of suppressed anger and guilt came pouring out in a torrent of words that seemed to surprise even her. "No, Father. You're the one on dangerous ground." You've spent so many years convincing yourself that what we do is justified, that we're somehow the victims in all this, but we're not. We're the ones who take from innocent people. We're the ones who destroy families and leave children orphaned. Enough! Jack roared, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering. You ungrateful little... His words were cut off by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. More riders were coming, but these carried the purposeful rhythm of lawmen rather than the chaotic gallop of outlaws. Deputy Morrison appeared out of the darkness with a posse of 6 men, their badges glinting in the moonlight. "Well, well," Morrison called out as he drew his rifle. "Looks like we got here just in time for a family reunion." The situation exploded into chaos. Jack's men wheeled their horses, reaching for weapons as the posse spread out to surround them. Morrison's voice rang out across the night. "This is the law. Lay down your weapons and surrender." Instead of surrendering, one of Jack's men opened fire, the muzzle flash lighting up the darkness like lightning. The posse returned fire immediately, and suddenly the peaceful homestead was transformed into a battlefield. "Get down!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Grace and pulling her behind the dubious cover of the porch railing. Through the chaos, he could see Joshua still standing in the doorway, frozen with terror. "Joshua!" Grace screamed, starting toward the boy despite the bullets flying overhead. "Get inside! Get your sister and brother and hide!" But before Joshua could move, a stray bullet shattered the window beside him, sending glass flying. The boy stumbled backward into the cabin, and Grace's maternal instincts overrode everything else. She broke free from Ethan's grasp and ran toward the cabin, heedless of the gunfire erupting around her. "Grace!" Ethan called after her, but his voice was lost in the thunderous roar of gunfire and shouting men. As Grace reached the cabin door, she turned back for one last look at the battle raging in their yard. Her father was crouched behind his horse, returning fire at the posse with deadly accuracy. 2 of his men were already down, dark shapes motionless in the dust. "This is what my life brings," she whispered to herself, the full weight of her family's legacy crushing down on her. "This is what I've brought to their door." The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the gun smoke finally cleared and the echoes of the last shots faded across the prairie, 4 of Jack's men lay dead. 3 more were wounded and captured. Jack himself had taken a bullet in the shoulder, but was still alive, still defiant as Morrison's men bound his hands. As they dragged him toward their horses, Jack looked back at Grace, who stood in the cabin doorway with the 3 children clustered around her. "This isn't over, daughter," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Blood calls to blood. You can't run from what you are forever." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness as the posse rode away with their prisoners. But his words lingered in the air like smoke, a promise and a threat that would haunt Grace's dreams for years to come. The gun smoke had barely cleared when the full weight of what had transpired began to settle over the homestead like a suffocating blanket. Grace stood in the cabin doorway, her arms wrapped protectively around the 3 children, watching as Deputy Morrison's men finished loading the dead outlaws onto a wagon. The yard that had been their peaceful sanctuary just hours before was now scarred with bullet holes and bloodstains that would serve as permanent reminders of the violence that had shattered their world. Joshua pressed closer to Grace's side, his small body trembling despite his efforts to appear brave. "Miss Grace," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the cleanup outside. "Are the bad men really gone?" Grace's heart broke at the trust in his voice, even after witnessing the gunfight that had erupted around their home. She knelt down to his level, gathering all 3 children into her embrace. "They're gone, sweetheart." Deputy Morrison took them away. But even as she spoke the words of comfort, Grace knew they weren't entirely true. Crimson Jack Whitmore might be in custody, but his influence, His legacy of violence would linger like a poison in their lives. She could see it already in the way Ethan stood apart from them, his face a mask of conflicted emotions as he spoke with Morrison near the barn. Emma tugged at Grace's skirt, her blue eyes wide with confusion. "Why did those men want to hurt us? We didn't do anything wrong." The innocent question cut deeper than any accusation could have. Grace struggled to find words that could explain the inexplicable, how the sins of a father could reach across years and miles to touch the lives of innocents, how her very presence had brought this violence to their door. "Sometimes bad things happen to good people," she said finally, the inadequacy of the explanation weighing heavily on her. "But you're safe now. That's what matters." Through the cabin window, Grace could see Morrison gesturing emphatically at Ethan, their conversation clearly growing heated. She couldn't hear their words, but the deputy's body language spoke volumes. When Morrison finally stalked away, climbing onto his horse with obvious frustration, Ethan remained by the barn, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and something that looked disturbingly like defeat. As the posse disappeared into the darkness, taking their prisoners and their dead with them, an oppressive silence settled over the homestead. The children, sensing the tension that had replaced their earlier security, clung to Grace with desperate intensity. Baby Samuel had fallen asleep in her arms, but his small fists remained tightly clenched in her dress, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Ethan finally approached the cabin, his footsteps heavy on the bullet-scarred porch. When Grace looked into his eyes, she saw a man wrestling with impossible choices, and her heart sank with the certainty of what was coming. "Morrison wants to talk to you tomorrow," Ethan said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. "He has questions about your father's activities, about what you might know regarding other gang hideouts, other crimes." Grace nodded, having expected as much. "And after I answer his questions?" Ethan's silence stretched between them like a chasm. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if he'd been rehearsing them. "The whole county knows by now. Word travels fast about gunfights, especially ones involving Crimson Jack Whitmore. By tomorrow, everyone will know that his daughter was here, that she was—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "That she was living with you and your children," Grace completed, her voice steady despite the pain lancing through her chest. "That you've been harboring the daughter of the most wanted outlaw in Texas." Joshua looked up at her with growing alarm. "Miss Grace, you're not leaving, are you? You promised you'd stay." The raw plea in his voice nearly undid her completely. Grace had never made such a promise, but she understood how a child's heart could interpret her presence, her care, as a pledge of permanence. She thought of all the bedtime stories she'd told, all the scraped knees she'd bandaged, all the quiet moments when these children had become as precious to her as if they were her own blood. "Joshua," she said gently, "sometimes grown-ups have to make very hard decisions, decisions that hurt even when they're the right thing to do." "No!" Emma burst out, her small face flushing with indignation. "You can't leave. We need you. Papa needs you." Grace's eyes met Ethan's over the children's heads, and she saw her own anguish reflected there. But she also saw something else, a resignation that told her the decision had already been made. "The bank," Ethan said suddenly, as if the words were being torn from him. "Morrison told me that Hawkins is demanding immediate payment of the loan, says that having outlaws shoot up the property makes it too much of a risk. He's moving up the foreclosure to next week." The financial blow was devastating, but Grace understood the deeper meaning. Even if she left, the damage was already done. Her father's visit had marked this family, branded them as associated with criminal elements. In a community where reputation meant everything, that association could be a death sentence. "There's more," Ethan continued, his voice growing hoarse. "Morrison says there's likely to be bounty hunters coming through, following leads on your father's gang. Federal marshals, too. This place will be under scrutiny for months, maybe years. Grace felt the walls closing in around them. Every path forward seemed to lead to pain, to loss, to the destruction of the fragile happiness they'd built together. She thought of her father's words before the shooting started, his cold assessment of the danger her presence brought to innocent lives. For once, Crimson Jack had been right about something. "I have to go," she said, the words falling like stones into still water. "Tonight, before dawn. It's the only way to protect you and the children." "No!" Joshua cried, his composure finally breaking. "You can't! We're a family now! Families don't leave each other!" Baby Samuel woke at the commotion, adding his wails to the growing chorus of distress. Emma wrapped her arms around Grace's legs, holding on with desperate strength. "Don't go, Miss Grace. Please don't go." Grace looked at Ethan, hoping against hope that he would contradict her, that he would fight for their future together. But his silence was answer enough. He loved her. She could see it in every line of his face, but he loved his children more, and she couldn't fault him for that. In his position, she would make the same choice. "Where will you go?" Ethan asked quietly. Grace hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been so focused on the immediate necessity of leaving that she hadn't considered what came after. California, maybe. Or Oregon. Somewhere far enough away that the Whitmore name doesn't carry the same weight. "The money," Ethan said suddenly. "Your father's money. Take it. You'll need it to start over." Grace shook her head. "That's blood money, Ethan. I won't touch it again. Use it to pay off the bank, to give the children a secure future. That's what matters now." They sat together on the porch as the night wore on, the children eventually falling asleep against Grace's shoulders. Neither adult spoke much. There seemed to be nothing left to say that wouldn't make the parting more painful than it already was. Grace memorized every detail of the scene, the weight of Samuel in her arms, the soft sound of Emma's breathing, the serious expression on Joshua's sleeping face. These were the memories she would carry with her into whatever future awaited. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Grace gently extricated herself from the sleeping children and began gathering her few belongings. Her hands shook as she folded the simple dresses that had comprised her wardrobe during these precious weeks of playing house, of pretending to be someone worthy of love and family. Ethan helped her saddle her horse, his movements mechanical and distant. When everything was ready, they stood facing each other in the pre-dawn light, two people whose love had been no match for the harsh realities of frontier justice. "I want you to know," Grace said, her voice thick with unshed tears, "that these weeks with you and the children have been the happiest of my entire life. Whatever happens next, I'll treasure these memories forever." Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers one last time. "Grace, if things were different—" "I know," she whispered. "I know." As she mounted her horse and rode away from the homestead, Grace didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see the place where she'd learned what it meant to be truly loved, truly needed, disappearing behind her. Instead, she focused on the road ahead, on the uncertain future that stretched before her like an empty page waiting to be written. Behind her, Ethan stood watching until she disappeared into the morning mist, his heart breaking with the knowledge that he was letting the best thing that had ever happened to his family ride away into danger. But sometimes, love meant making the hardest choice of all, the choice to let go. 3 days after Grace's departure, the silence in the Blackwood cabin had become a living thing, pressing against the walls and settling into every corner like dust after a windstorm. The children moved through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, their usual chatter replaced by a listlessness that broke Ethan's heart anew each time he witnessed it. Joshua had stopped asking when Miss Grace would return, but Ethan caught him standing at the window every morning, scanning the horizon with the desperate hope that only children possess. Emma had barely spoken since that terrible dawn, picking at her meals and clinging to the rag doll that Grace had mended for her on that first day. Baby Samuel cried more frequently now, as if sensing that the gentle hands and soothing voice he'd grown accustomed to were gone forever. The house felt hollow, stripped of the warmth and life that Grace had brought to their lives. Ethan tried to maintain normalcy, but every routine task served as a painful reminder of what they'd lost, setting 3 places at the table instead of 4, hanging laundry that would never be as neatly arranged as when Grace had done it, attempting to braid Emma's hair, and watching his daughter's face crumple when his clumsy fingers couldn't replicate Grace's gentle touch. It was on the 4th morning that Dr. Harrison Webb arrived at the homestead, his medical bag in hand and an expression of grave concern on his weathered face. Ethan met him at the door, surprised by the unexpected visit. "Doc Webb, what brings you out here?" "None of us are sick." Webb's eyes, pale and calculating behind wire-rimmed spectacles, studied Ethan's haggard appearance. "I heard about the trouble you had with the Whitmore gang. Thought I should check on you and the children, make sure there were no lasting effects from the excitement." There was something in the doctor's tone that made Ethan uneasy, but he stepped aside to let the older man enter. Webb's gaze swept the cabin, taking in the bullet holes that still marked the walls, the children's subdued demeanor, and the general air of melancholy that pervaded the space. "Where's the woman?" Webb asked casually, setting his bag on the table. "The one who treated your snake bite, Miss Whitmore, wasn't it?" "She's gone," Ethan replied curtly. "Left after the shooting." Webb nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Probably for the best. A woman with that kind of background wouldn't have been a suitable influence on young children." Ethan felt a flare of anger at the casual dismissal of Grace's character, but before he could respond, Webb continued. "You know, Ethan, I've been thinking about that snake bite of yours." Remarkable recovery, really. Coral snake venom is usually fatal within hours without proper medical intervention. Yet here you are, completely healthy. Makes a man wonder what kind of treatment you received. "Grace saved my life," Ethan said firmly. "Her quick thinking and medical knowledge kept me alive until you could get here." "Medical knowledge," Webb repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, she certainly seemed to know her way around trauma medicine. Almost like she'd had extensive practice treating violent injuries, the kind of practice one might get living with outlaws." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Ethan studied the doctor's face, seeing something there that hadn't been present during previous visits. There was a coldness in Webb's pale eyes, a calculating quality that made Ethan's skin crawl. "What are you getting at, Doc?" Webb smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "I'm simply making observations, Ethan. For instance, I observed that your wife Rebecca died under my care 18 months ago. Tragic case of childbed fever, as I recall, despite my best efforts, of course." The casual mention of Rebecca's death seemed oddly placed, but before Ethan could question it, Joshua appeared in the doorway leading to the bedrooms. The boy's face was pale, and he moved with the careful steps of someone who didn't want to draw attention to himself. "Papa," Joshua whispered, "Emma won't stop crying. She wants Miss Grace." Webb's attention shifted to the child with predatory interest. "Hello there, young man. You must be Joshua. I've heard quite a lot about you." Joshua pressed closer to his father's side, his instincts warning him away from the doctor despite the man's friendly tone. Ethan's protective instincts flared as he noticed the way Webb was studying his son. "Maybe you should tend to your daughter," Webb suggested. "Children can be so fragile when they're upset." Accidents happen so easily. The subtle threat in the doctor's words sent ice through Ethan's veins. He placed a protective hand on Joshua's shoulder, his mind racing to understand what was happening. This wasn't the same man who had treated his family for minor ailments over the past 2 years. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous wearing a familiar mask. "I think you should leave," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made Webb's smile widen. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, Ethan, we have quite a lot to discuss, starting with your late wife's death." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. "What about Rebecca's death?" Webb reached into his medical bag, but instead of pulling out medical instruments, his hand emerged holding a small leather journal. "This contains detailed records of all my patients, including the specific treatments I administered." Very thorough documentation, as any good doctor maintains. He opened the journal to a specific page, his finger tracing lines of careful handwriting. "Here we have Rebecca Blackwood, admitted for childbed fever following the birth of her third child. Treatment administered: willow bark extract for fever reduction, laudanum for pain management, and—" he paused dramatically, "a series of mercury compounds that I claimed would help with the infection." Ethan's blood turned to ice. Mercury compounds? Highly toxic, as any medical professional knows, but very effective for certain purposes. "Your wife didn't die from childbed fever, Ethan. She died from deliberate mercury poisoning, administered over the course of several days to make it appear natural." The confession hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hand tightening protectively on Joshua's shoulder as the full implications of Webb's words sank in. You murdered my wife?" "Such an ugly word," Webb said conversationally. "I prefer to think of it as solving a problem. You see, your homestead sits on some very valuable land, cattle country, with access to good water and natural grazing. My brother Theodore, you know him as Banker Hawkins, he'd been trying to acquire this property for months." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The bank's increasingly aggressive demands for payment. Hawkins's eagerness to foreclose despite Ethan's previous good standing. The convenient timing of Rebecca's death, leaving Ethan struggling alone with 3 small children and mounting debts. "You and Hawkins planned this," Ethan said, his voice hollow with shock. "You killed Rebecca to destabilize my finances, to force me into default." Webb nodded approvingly. "Very good. Yes, that was the general idea. A widower with 3 young children can't effectively manage a ranch. Default was inevitable, and Theodore would acquire the land at a fraction of its value, a perfectly legal transaction." Joshua whimpered softly, pressing closer to his father. The boy couldn't fully understand the adult conversation, but he could sense the danger radiating from the doctor like heat from a fire. "But then that Whitmore woman arrived," Webb continued, his expression darkening. "Suddenly you weren't the desperate, struggling widower we needed you to be. You were recovering, thriving even. The children were happy, healthy, well cared for. It became clear that our original plan needed adjustment." Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt, but Webb was faster. The doctor's hand emerged from his bag holding a small but deadly derringer, its barrel pointed directly at Joshua's head. "I wouldn't recommend any heroic gestures," Webb said calmly. "Children's skulls are remarkably fragile." The threat against his son galvanized Ethan into perfect stillness, and every muscle in his body screamed for action, but the sight of that gun pointed at Joshua kept him frozen in place. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the rage and fear warring in his chest. "Originally, I wanted you broken and bankrupt, ready to sell this land for pennies on the dollar, but circumstances have changed. The Whitmore gang's attack has given us a much simpler solution. You see, everyone in the county now knows that your homestead was a hideout for dangerous criminals. Who would question it if more violence occurred here? If a desperate father, driven mad by grief and isolation, committed a terrible act?" The implication was crystal clear. Webb intended to kill them all and make it look like a murder-suicide. The tragic end to a man pushed beyond his breaking point by loss and criminal association. "People will find it quite believable," Webb continued conversationally. The poor widower, already unstable from his wife's death, completely snapped after harboring outlaw criminals, shot his children to spare them from shame, then turned the gun on himself. A sad but understandable tragedy. Ethan's mind raced, searching for any advantage, any opportunity to protect his children, but with the doctor's gun pointed at Joshua's head, his options were terrifyingly limited. "Of course," Webb added with mock thoughtfulness, "there might be another way to resolve this situation. If you were willing to sign over the deed to this property, to walk away with your children and never return, well, accidents could be avoided." It was an impossible choice. Lose everything they'd worked for or lose their lives. But as Ethan looked at Joshua's terrified face, at the bedroom door behind which Emma and baby Samuel waited unknowingly, he knew there was really no choice at all. "The deed is in the strongbox, under the floorboards," Ethan said quietly. "But I'll need both hands to retrieve it." Webb's smile was triumphant. "Of course. But remember, any sudden movements and the boy dies first." As Ethan knelt slowly beside the hidden strongbox, his fingers working at the concealed latches, his mind was already calculating distances and angles. He had one chance, one split second when Webb's attention might waver. It would have to be enough, because somewhere out there, Grace was riding toward an uncertain future, believing that her sacrifice had saved this family. Ethan was damned if he'd let her heroism be in vain. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would protect his children, even if it meant dying in the attempt. The strongbox opened with a soft click, and Ethan's hand closed around the deed to his land, and the loaded pistol he kept hidden beneath it. The next few seconds would determine whether his family lived or died. And in that moment, he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching fast across the prairie. The hoofbeats grew louder, thundering across the hardpan with the desperate urgency of a rider pushing their mount to its limits. Dr. Webb's head snapped toward the window, his grip on the derringer wavering for just an instant, but it was enough. Ethan's hand closed around his pistol, and he rolled sideways, pulling Joshua down with him as the cabin door exploded inward. Grace Whitmore burst through the doorway like an avenging angel, her own gun drawn and her green eyes blazing with fury. "Get away from them!" Webb spun toward this new threat, his derringer swinging away from Joshua. "You should be halfway to California by now." "I got 3 miles down the road before I realized I was making the biggest mistake of my life," Grace said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "A wise woman once told me that sometimes love requires the courage to be happy." "I'm done running from mine." Ethan took advantage of Webb's momentary distraction to roll behind the overturned table, pulling Joshua with him. "Grace, he killed Rebecca. He and his brother planned it all." The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow, but her gun never wavered. "You murdering bastard! Those children lost their mother because of your greed." Webb's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand. This land is worth a fortune. Theodore and I have invested everything in securing the water rights. These dirt farmers don't deserve—" His words were cut off by the sharp crack of Grace's pistol. The derringer flew from Webb's hand as her bullet shattered his wrist. He screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his wounded arm against his chest. "That's for Rebecca," Grace said coldly. "This is for threatening her children." Her second shot took Webb in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Outside, more riders were approaching, Deputy Morrison and his men drawn by the gunfire. As Morrison and his posse burst into the cabin, they found Webb bleeding on the floor while Grace stood over him, her smoking pistol still trained on his head. Ethan emerged from behind the table with Joshua, both of them shaken but unharmed. "What in the hell is going on here?" Morrison demanded, his own weapon drawn. Dr. Harrison Webb just confessed to murdering my wife, Ethan said, his voice hoarse with emotion. He and banker Hawkins planned to steal my land by killing Rebecca and forcing me into bankruptcy. Morrison's weathered face hardened as he took in the scene. That's a serious accusation, Ethan. Grace reached into Webb's medical bag and pulled out the leather journal. It's all documented in here. Dates, dosages, the whole murder plot written in his own hand. As Morrison examined the journal, his expression grew increasingly grim. The careful documentation of Rebecca's treatment told a story of deliberate poisoning that no jury would fail to understand. Jesus Christ, Webb, Morrison breathed. You really did murder her. Webb, pale from blood loss and shock, tried one last desperate gambit. She's lying. That journal is fake. You can't trust the word of Crimson Jack Whitmore's daughter. Actually, Morrison said slowly, that brings up an interesting point. Miss Whitmore, why aren't you halfway to the next territory by now? Grace straightened her shoulders, meeting the deputy's gaze directly. Because I realized I was letting fear make my decisions instead of love. These children need me, and I need them. Whatever consequences come from my father's crimes, I'll face them, but I won't abandon this family again. Emma's voice came from the bedroom doorway, small and hopeful. Miss Grace, are you really staying? Grace holstered her pistol and knelt down as Emma ran to her, followed by baby Samuel toddling on unsteady legs. She gathered them both into her arms, tears streaming down her face. Yes, sweetheart, I'm staying, forever, if your papa will have me. Ethan moved to join them, wrapping his arms around Grace and the children. Always, he said simply. You're home, Grace. This is where you belong. Morrison cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotional reunion but practical about the situation. Miss Whitmore, there's still the matter of your association with your father's gang, which saved my life and exposed a murderer, Ethan pointed out firmly. Grace's knowledge of medicine kept me alive when Webb's conspiracy would have preferred me dead. Grace looked up at Morrison, her voice steady with newfound resolve. Deputy, I'll testify against my father and provide any information that might help bring justice to his victims. But I won't be driven away from the people I love by fear of what others might think. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her weathered face creased with concern. Heard the shooting from my place. Everyone all right? Her eyes took in the scene. Webb bleeding on the floor, the family embracing, Grace's determined expression. Better than all right, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. We're finally complete. As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Blackwood family stood together on their porch. The land that had nearly cost them everything was finally truly theirs. Grace's hand rested on her stomach, where new life was already beginning to grow, a symbol of hope and renewal after so much darkness. Joshua tugged at Grace's skirt. Miss Grace, will you tell us a story? I have a better idea, Grace said, smiling down at him. How about we start writing our own story? One with a happy ending. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, that's exactly what they did. Sometimes life hands us second chances wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Like Grace Whitmore, many of us have run from happiness because we believed we weren't worthy of it, that our past mistakes disqualified us from love and belonging. We convince ourselves that protecting others means sacrificing our own joy, when sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stay and fight for the family we've found. Grace's story reminds us that home isn't just a place. It's where people see your scars and love you anyway. It's where children call you family, not because you share blood, but because you've chosen to pour your heart into theirs. For those of us who've buried spouses, raised children alone, or felt like outsiders looking in on happiness, remember, it's never too late to come home to love. The bread we offer others, our kindness, our presence, Our willingness to help often feeds our own hungry souls in return. True belonging happens when we stop running from who we were and embrace who we're becoming. Grace found her family not despite her broken past, but because of the strength it gave her to love fiercely. What moment in your life taught you that love was worth fighting for? Have you ever walked away from happiness because you thought you didn't deserve it? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.